welcome to another edition of Top Shot, in which we interview a very distinguished personality who talk to us on various issues, which of course concern to you and me. And this time we are very fortunate to have a very distinguished jurist, Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, in the studio. We're talking to us about how you are now enjoying your new role as a member of parliament.
Well, it's a big learning curve. It's very enjoyable. It's multitasking, of course, which is sometimes strenuous. And the multitasking involves parliament and dealing with the media as a spokesperson and doing what little law practice I enjoy doing. So I think all these three are jealous mistresses, all demanding time and energy. But as long as you enjoy what you're doing, it's always very energizing. In particular, I think Parliament gives an opportunity to see facets of political life and have discourses which are really missing in the sound bites of the press alone or in just casual conversation outside.
In fact, that is something very true. As a fellow member of parliament, I will share your views that normally when we make a point in the parliament, debate in the parliament on issues of great importance, we don't get that much viewership of that, or it's read outside the parliament in terms of media coverage. Why does that happen actually?
I think here there is to be one finger pointing out and one finger pointing in. The finger pointing at ourselves is stating the obvious. We have just too many disruptions, and frequently we do not seem to be interested in debate. I'm using the word seem. And I think that puts people off, it puts viewers off, it puts people in the gallery off, because they may come at a time when there is complete chaos and pandemonium, and it gives a wrong impression. But there has to be two other aspects which we forget. One is the finger pointing out. The press is no less responsible. There are some extremely important, very useful, very in-depth research debates. I have sat through them several times between 2 and 5 in the afternoon session, frequently in the pre-lunch session as well. A serious debate, even in the pre-lunch session, even on an important issue. I want to make 2 points here. One, take the Indo-US debate or on the nuclear deal, or take the reply to the president's address, or take internal security, or take office of profit. Yeah. These are all debates which I have done, so I am speaking on them. The reporting system is such that the print media hardly reports it. The two things reported are, one, at the most, the minister's winding up speech. Okay. Two, at the most, and that too not frequently, the opening batsman, which is from the opposition. That's the nitty-gritty of the debate and even the opening batsman from the opposition hardly gets reported. Yeah. So the press has to ask itself, they will report a sex scandal, they will report a spicy news, they will report a inconsequential trivial news. How much space? They have a fixed space. Page X, 5 columns, 3 columns, max, for all parliament news. Yeah. All parliament news means everything should be clubbed together and reported. So the essence of the quality of the debate is lost, and I think the press owe it to the nation to improve their reporting systems. If you can give so much space, not only to ads but to sensationalism, give some space to sense and little less space to sensationalism.
In fact, I also heard so many excellent debates in the parliament which influenced me so much personally. But next day I was just opening the newspaper and I didn't even find a mention about a speaker having spoken in the parliament. That's something I think we really need to do. But as a member of parliament, do you think that when you make a very good point in the parliament, and I've seen that you're doing that on many occasions, do you think it has any influence on government's functioning? Because the job of a parliament essentially is to exercise control of the executive. How responsive is the executive to the deliberations in the parliament?
Well, I think to be very frank with you, and the sad truth is that yes, that influence is declining, except that you do have a moral influence sometimes. But this is a problem with the parliamentary system itself. Somebody called it a hyphen. A hyphen is created between the executive and the legislature. The executive, when it becomes a subset of the legislature and is a hyphenated link with it, in that sense there is no separation of powers. And therefore, the aggressively antagonistic stands between an executive and a legislature, as you find, for example, in USA or France, will not be available in the parliamentary British system. But that does not mean we have to ask ourselves the question that even in the British system, in Great Britain itself, or indeed in Canada and Australia, the average MP even of the own government which is in power and of the opposition, does exercise a greater moral authority. He exercises also greater practical authority. That is the question we have to ask ourselves, because we can't change the overall system from parliamentary to non-parliamentary, and I don't think that solves the problem either. But certainly we have to ask ourselves why. And the answer is simple. The answer is that we have ourselves, and I don't mean it for any one person, any one party, any one entity. Over the years, we have devalued Parliament as an institution. Tell me, the comment of a Madhuleme, whichever party he belonged to, or of a Nathpai, or of even of a Bhupesh Gupta, carried a different weight in the 60s and the 70s. We have very eminent members today. It doesn't carry the same weight.
Yeah, that's one is of course that quality of debate will depend upon that, quality of influence will depend upon the personalities.
Yes.
But again, there is some problem. It seems that now we have almost 60 years of independence and 14th Lok Sabha is already functioning. Do you think we should really look into the way our parliament functions vis-a-vis exercising control of the executive? For example, we started the first generation, I call it first generation really, but first time we started when Mr. Shivraj Patil was the speaker, a concept of standing committees. We didn't have before that. Now I think we have seen a good functioning of standing committees, and it's a very bipartisan approach. We really evaluate issues. We get enough time to ask questions to executive, not the ministers of course, but to the officers. But also we get a lot of outside wisdom into the functioning, because we call people from outside, talk to them. Do you think now we really need to, having learned so much on the standing committees, we should move to the second generation standing committees in which we could have more control of legislature or the executive?
I think there is at least partial merit in what you say, and I think the time has come at least to experiment and to innovate, because without innovation we will become more stereotyped. Let me make 2 or 3 quick points here. One, that ultimately we have to go into nitty-gritty reform of Parliament. If you have an overall reform of the system, you will find a change, and the overall reform includes small things like getting less disruptions, getting limited time limits implemented so that more people can speak, and getting a point of view across. That's one part. As you do that, your eminence and your status and your stature in the eyes of the public and the general country will improve and increase, which automatically will lead to your comments being taken more seriously by the executive also. Now coming to the issue of standing committees, I think it's a very useful innovation. I'm in fact surprised why in the earlier years we did not have it. But we need again a reinforcement. A simple reinforcement. Let me give you an example. Today, a report of a committee is technically not binding on anybody. I mean, the report is there in a moral sense, it comes. It doesn't even bind the own house in which it is submitted. So it becomes another glorified thing sitting on a shelf after some time. We can perhaps experiment with a law which says that a standing committee's report, unless, reverse the burden, unless for reasons to be recorded in writing, and that too within 3 months or 2 months or X months, shall be deemed to have been accepted by the executive, except that they are entitled to put on record that these parts we don't accept and for these reasons. And if the reasons are given, then it will be debated in the House before it is finally rejected. So you put 2 controls. One, normal rule, shift the burden, and normally a standing committee report becomes binding. 2, you give an escape route that you may object to it for reasons to be given in writing. 3, even when it's rejected with reasons, that reason has to be debated in the House at a fixed time. Now these 3 simple innovations, as an example only I am saying, will immediately reinforce the stature of these committees. After all, and you and I are both members of several committees, there is the good and the bad, but we all understand one thing, that the relative more partisanship or the appearance of a party political kind of a alignment is much less in these committees. We tend to be more open, we tend to be more frank, and good work is done. We have some top experts of the country appearing and coming. All that is lost if it is not given even the minimum weightage of a rejection for reasons to be recorded in writing. In fact, I made this suggestion more than 10-15 years ago for our Commission of Inquiry reports. The Commission of Inquiry Act is an act of Parliament. If you have a Commission of Inquiry, don't appoint one. If you appoint one, at least accept its report, deemed to be accepted, unless for reasons to be recorded in writing, you reject it.
Absolutely. In fact, that's the least one could do, because standing committees having gone into so much of work, having involved so many experts, not to get it accepted and not to know why it is not accepted.
And you are not making the government into a straitjacket, because you are giving the government the option of rejecting. So you are having a balance of both sides.
One of the things standing committees could probably do, I mean, 1 or 2 things. One, I was just thinking about, we have a public accounts committee, which in fact goes into various aspects of, it's an audit function. But that audit function again is reporting to the management, and in this case actually reporting to the people of India who are the real managers of, supposed to be the owners of this whole process, if I call it them owners. Now the standing committees who debate reports of Public Accounts Committee related to the ministries to which the standing committees are attached. Because today what's happening, the Public Accounts Committee doesn't get enough time. Many of the observations of the Comptroller and Auditor General do not get to the PSC. So can we do something like this to begin with?
Well, I mean, logically, it should be happening because a standing committee is supposed to deal with everything relating to that particular ministry. Really, nothing is out of bounds for that committee. Obviously, if there are adverse or other comments in a PSC or in a Comptroller General or any such report regarding that department or that ministry, it should fall in the domain of the standing committee. Merely because it is also part of the PSC should not be a ground for excluding a discussion in the standing committee. Again, I think this is something very, it's non-invasive because both are parliamentary committees and there's no reason why not. I think we should develop a practice. It's a good innovative suggestion.
Yeah, and again, of course, we have a very unique system, as you said. It's unlike a French or a US model because we are following Westminster model in the UK. But do you think, is it now time that we can look at reviewing performance of some of the top bureaucrats in a ministry to which the standing committee is attached? For example, we don't have a system whereby, unlike in the US, where the new president comes, he brings along with him the huge new administration. But we don't have the system. We have a steel frame in which bureaucracy functions irrespective of political changes. But is it not time that we can at least review the performance in the standing committees and can make comments on how they're done because we are trying to bring about bureaucratic reform?
No, I understand the spirit of your question, but I think we have to tread cautiously. We have to hasten slowly in this area. But yes, some things can be. Let me explain how. Number one, we have to live with the system that we are living in a parliamentary democracy, a British model. So it's no point raising the larger debate, should we have an American system, should we have a French system? And frankly, I don't think it's going to solve the problem. If the major problems of the polity today are communalism, casteism, corruption, criminalization, it's not like a magic wand that you change the Indian British system to an American system and do you think you'll do away with criminalization or corruption? No. So, as Palkhiwala once put it nicely, he said, when your house is on fire, don't engage in a debate whether you should convert your study into a bedroom or a bedroom into a kitchen. So that may be a futile thing. That's one. Two, however, within the system, reforms should be considered. Now, the reform you suggested just now, there's an interesting aspect. You cannot try to put a square hole into a round peg. If the system is British parliamentary, you can't transplant an American system, the spoil system, for example. The spoil system is not just one idea. It comes with a whole system, a whole package. You appoint your own people, they need not be elected members of parliament either way, etc., etc. You can't have that system here. Equally, the separation of the bureaucracy, and in our British system, there's an interesting old constitutional principle that the bureaucracy is anonymous. That's a fiction, whereby the entire bureaucracy culminates in the minister, who takes the responsibility in the house. The attack and the answerability of the minister, the accountability is his. The bureaucrat in that sense is not accountable.
The administrative head of the ministry.
The bureaucracy is not accountable to the legislature because it is accountable only through the minister. So in that direct sense, we don't have a scrutiny. But these old fictions, I agree with you, need to be challenged and relooked at. Let me put it like this, that all other organs, especially the political one, is far more accountable today. With all the ills, I am not condoning the political system because there are a lot of ills in it and there is corruption. But with that corruption, there is accountability. There is much less accountability in the bureaucracy. And methods to increase their accountability should be there. However, I don't think you can have a direct standing committee or legislative review of bureaucrats. The way you should do it is to have first a change in the system in which the bureaucracy itself is reviewed by the ministry. We don't have yet in the IAS, apart from the CR system, we don't have a total comprehensive review system. Let us first create within the executive, not in the legislature, not in the standing committee, within the executive, a primary review. And the primary review is not the CR review, which is, number of O's and A's and things, but a more comprehensive review system. Let that primary one come for a secondary review to the standing committee, and for a start, the secondary review of the standing committee can be recommendatory. That's a gentler way of putting your foot in, and it also fits with the British model. If you straight away say the bureaucrat can come in front of you and stand and you say, okay, what is the performance? Your promotion will depend on what the standing committee says. It won't work because there is a mismatch there. But why not have a primary review, which is a properly considered one, and a secondary one by the standing committees, and over time you will find that the two will be able to coalesce.
Again, the separation of power you talked about between executive, judiciary and legislature presupposes that legislature will legislate, executive will execute, and of course judiciary will review all this. But slowly we are seeing over a period of time that who is really responsible for policy making? That's a question which actually has remained little unanswered. And maybe in the vacuum that was created, that nobody answered that question very effectively, because constitution was not very clear about that. I mean, it's clear in a sense, but not very, I would say, unambiguous little bit. So maybe the executive has usurped the power of policy making, which in my opinion should be the sole responsibility of the parliament, because executive has to execute what is made. How can you execute something which is not made? So somebody has to make the policy, and in the absence of both executive and legislature not doing their job good enough, now judiciary is in fact in a way making policy. So do you think primacy of making policy should be the prerogative of the legislature?
This is a very interesting question, but it's also a technical question. Let me just make a few simpler and short points. One, I think it's important to remember that the legislature also doesn't make and should not make policy. It is entitled to legislate. Two, therefore, in the area which is occupied by legislative act or act of parliament, certainly the policy has to be reflected in the act passed itself. And once that policy is reflected there, the executive will be bound by it as much as the rest of the country. And that is the right approach. Three, however, the problem is that there are vast areas which are not addressed by legislation. This happened way back in the 30s in England, where they said that it's a fiction to think that the country is run by legislature, because legislature may make 100 laws, but the administration is done by 1,000 rules and regulations and 1,000,000 executive orders which have to be passed under that, and they never go to the legislature, and they can't. So therefore, real governance, what should be the size of a jelly in the Second World War? There's an interesting book written by C.K. Allen about how the real work and administration is done in the interstices of these executive orders and not in the legislature. Now, as long as that is true, you cannot really say that the executive has no power, because they purport to act or operate in an unoccupied field. Where the legislative act occupies, there is no problem. I think the correct balance would be to consider a system whereby a lot of these problems arise because of the party political system, not because of legislature or executive. If you have on the British parliamentary model superimposed a party political system, it is but inevitable that the legislature will comprise of a leading party, the power ruling party, and the non-ruling party. And it is but natural to expect that the executive, which will be a subset of the ruling party, there cannot be too much of a antagonism between the two. So perhaps unless we change that basic system, it would be ideal to consider that there would be no policy making by the executive and all policy making by the legislature. Or alternatively, you will have to design a system whereby you start treating, and this is a very interesting new point, you start treating delegated legislation equal to legislation itself. Yeah. In which case, Parliament will have to sit at least 1.5 times to 2 times more than the time it gives today. Yeah. Because today Parliament can barely do legislation. If you include the entire delegated legislation, you need to have that much more time to deal, because that is the nitty-gritty of policy today, not the legislation.
But maybe it's possible that both can make policies. Legislature can think out making policy, and executive also can make policy, but the policy will not be final unless it is approved by the Parliament. So both can introduce. Legislature can on its own volition can introduce.
It goes without saying. Once the legislature introduces something, then of course the primacy of the legislature is clear. Suppose there is any rule, regulation or law passed by legislature, even by way of a resolution, I am not talking of a proper law, there is no doubt that will bind.
The will of the Parliament.
But we don't have time. Where do we have the time to do it? And who moves it? It is only the government of the day who moves it. That's the catch. The government of the day will not move it if it finds it can deal with it at its own level. Why will they bring it to Parliament?
Then probably we'll have to look at how much time the members of Parliament should really devote to such activities, etc.
And perhaps a law which gives a list that certain issues have to be brought to Parliament before. I am not making any value judgment, but take for example today the treaty argument. There is a dispute that whether you should have a 123 treaty passed by Parliament or approved by Parliament at least or not, or whether. Now the law is very clear, the practice, it is in the executive domain, treaty making. But if you were to make a law which says that in 10 areas You will not do executive decision making unless parliamentary resolution is there.
Yeah.
Then those 10 areas will have to go to legislature. But we have not passed any such law.
That's
And we have to define in that law the 10 areas will be treaties on ABC, agreements on so and so, price rise issues, Essential Commodities Act issues. In that case, they will go not for legislation in parliament, but for a resolution of parliament. That will make the executive policy subject to parliamentary approval, acting through resolution, not through act. That will be a good innovation, but for that we need a very different culture of more work.
No, actually, just taking on this small last point you made about, there are some international treaties now we are signing. Like we have a nuclear deal which is signed by the executive, which is to be ratified by the US Senate and Congress. But we have number of such deals now, WTO, wherein we actually bind a country for another 20-25 years
That's right.
of a new regime. Climate change, which is going to be so important now, and we are going to have in Copenhagen 2009 a successor to Kyoto Protocol, in which we'll be actually again binding the country for another 20, maybe 100 years. Now, do you think such type of international treaties, though today there is no parliamentary approval required, but do you think we should try to bring about a change whereby to provide a stability to such processes?
You have given 3 very important and good examples, and all 3 could as well have been requirements of an act of parliament. Could as well. My problem is a little different. One, unless there is a consistent rule, how do you do it? You cannot say that this government should subject a WTO and a Kyoto to a parliamentary approval, and the next government may say, no, I'm not obliged to do it, why should I do it? And the third government, so the first point is that you have to make a consistent rule. I am not saying the rule should be this way or that way. The rule can be either way, but the rule has to exist. It cannot be opportunistic that in this particular case somebody asks for it to be subject to parliamentary approval, and next time around when somebody else's government is there, you forget about the rule. So, number 2, I think that certainly there is great merit in what you say, for the simple reason that some of these things affect the country as a whole. I am not talking about any particular deal, but take for example anything on WTO or even on Kyoto. It is not a reflection of distrust necessarily in your executive government or whichever the government of the day. We are not talking about party, but it is also a measure of the importance. Certainly, and I think the right via media for some of them, but it has to be by law. A parliamentary act has to say that we further say that in these 10 areas, any decision taken will not need a law, but will be subject to parliamentary approval.
So I think you have made a point that we should try to change some of these things by making new laws, and I think I will just take a short break and we'll continue the talk that we are having, very interesting talk on how the parliament should be functioning, how it can reflect the aspirations of the people. We'll come back, don't go away. We are talking to Dr. Abhishek Singhvi. Welcome back to Top Shot, a program in which we talk to distinguished personality on various issues concerning you and me. And today we are talking to Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, a very eminent jurist who has really, I would say, sacrificed some of his professional life to join politics. Dr. Singhvi, tell me something. Many people think that politics we should not join because it's too much of a problem. And then quality of politics is going down because probably many people think like this. What is the real way to address this problem? Because we need good politicians. At the same time, politics today, the way it is run, is also creating ways of not allowing good people to join politics.
This is a real dilemma, and it's partly a dilemma I have personally faced. Your success in other fields itself becomes your enemy in going into the political field, because you do well there, you are busy there, and you don't have any particular need or urge to go. However, that leads to the result, as you said, that not all the right people enter politics. the person with more time, so-called time to politics, is not necessarily the right person. I dispute that. But let me also do a bit of finger pointing, if you don't mind. I think the political class as a whole, I'm not talking about any individual or party or any person, but the political class as a whole also wants it to be that way. I call myself an insider. After all, I am a spokesperson of a big party, I am a member of parliament, I deal with issues, so I am an insider. But in that sense, I am also an outsider. And the political class as a whole doesn't necessarily want, I get the feeling sometimes, people who have alternative talents, people who need not and do not want to be just full-time politicians in the sense of the nitty-gritty of only doing politics, but may have alternative talents. I would have thought that's a virtue. But does the political class think like that? And I also question, these are very controversial areas, so I don't know, I'm speaking purely privately, I'm not speaking on behalf of any party, but I also question this concept that, you need to be only in an electoral format to do good. If politics is redefined as public life, there's a lot of good you can do whether you are electoral or not electoral. In fact, as you know, as a very eminent and a repeatedly successful electorally fighting politician, electoral politics leads you to be subject to several populist compulsions, which you are freed from if you are not necessarily in electoral politics.
Yeah.
As we said jokingly in a debate that you should not think of members of parliament not only as unemployed casuals, but also as unemployable. So if somebody has a talent as a doctor, as an architect, as a very eminent management consultant, or take yourself, so many technical issues you deal with, a chartered accountant, why should that be disqualification? Now the usual answer to that is, it's a disqualification because, he doesn't have time. But he has time for everything which you give him.
Yeah.
He does everything which you give him, but he also has an alternative life which he tries to maintain with integrity and with enjoyment. Why should you grudge him that? I think this is a question which the entire political class as a whole, because there's no point lamenting you don't have good people.
Yeah.
You will not have good people if you put a kind of a implied bar. Let me tell you, there is an implied bar.
Yeah. In fact, right now, unfortunately, if you introspect, people outside don't like politicians anymore. But as you and me have seen, there are many, many good politicians, including very distinguished members of parliament, who are really doing a good job, and really very genuine people I've seen come across. Do you think, on one hand, we talk about sovereignty of parliament as an institution over everything else, they are the supreme. But members of parliament individually are not as powerful as they should be. So do you think we really need to strike a balance between empowering an institution, but also at the same time making sure that the individuals who actually run the institution, the members of parliament themselves, are also empowered?
Well, I think really the answer is that there is a overall collective devaluation of parliament over the years. If the whole institution is devalued over the years, and I don't mean it as any accusation or insult, but it's a fact, it's a reality. Less debates, more time wasted. Parliament is still very good. Go to the state assemblies. You know that about 50% probably of state assemblies in the country meet for less than 2 months a year. 2 months in a 12-month period. Yeah. Parliament meets for 5.5 months. During that time, how much time is left or lost, we don't count. Now, if over time the temple of democracy for debate and discourse, somebody called it the grand inquest of the nation, becomes diluted, then how can the constituent elements like you and me be individually empowered? Yeah. So I think the answer is the same. Collectively, we have to think that if you call yourself a parliamentary democracy, you are virtually erasing one out of the two crucial words. Yeah. It's a democracy, but it's not a parliamentary democracy. Yeah. Then what kind of democracy is it? So this is actually a pillar of democracy itself, and this is something, it's individually each member of parliament is responsible.
So I think we really need to bring about change in that, and today we are seeing as lawmakers, and in fact our responsibility really ends by making law. But actually the work begins when the law is made, because that's where the executive takes over and starts implementing law and try to do it. We are seeing a general huge deterioration in governance generally in the country, which is also one of the reasons why we are seeing huge Naxalite activity growing in different parts of the country, because people don't get justice, so they go to the elements which they think can provide them justice. So you think the governance is something which is again at peril, and we have a serious challenge to deal with issues related to governance as such?
Well, I agree with you and I disagree with you. And there's an interesting split level Jekyll and